let's talk about another public intellectual, Foucault.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting about him. I'm a great fan of Chomsky's, who we'll get on to later. Chomsky hates the postmodernists, and as do I, actually, because they talk gibberish all the time, and they've destroyed the intellectual universe. These posers in the Sorbonne in the 1950s have ended up saying, truth is not truth. I changed my mind from one sentence to another. What Derrida says now is not what Derrida says later. Has ended up in some Egypts talking to Donald Trump, or Mr. Giuliani saying, truth is not truth, Donald, as Giuliani did in a recent interview. So they've been responsible for everything as they exported their disease.
Of New York, Giuliani, yeah?
Yeah, as they exported their disease to the North American universities. And Chomsky despises them and also regards them as I do, as incomprehensible, and saying nothing of any linguistic or syntactical exactitude or making any sense. But interestingly, Chomsky has a soft spot, as I do, for Michel Foucault. And there are many reasons why Foucault is not just the most redeemable of the postmoderns, but actually says quite a lot of things of significance. One of the reasons, I think, is that Foucault is not an abstract philosopher talking indecipherable gibberish. His books are works at one level of history and the analysis of history. So they are grounded in narrative empiricism and fact, and therefore they can be, yes, there are theories and interpretation, but they can be subject to the empirical tradition of fact-checking and critique to see if they actually stand up and what he says makes sense. The other thing, even allowing for my distaste for postmodernism, he makes points that are incredibly, I think, important to the present day and age. And if I could break them down, one of them is in his book, Discipline and Punishment. He uses an example from Jeremy Bentham, the English positivist empiricist philosopher and legal philosopher, of the panopticon. And Bentham invented this perfect imprisonment technique, which certain prisons, including Kilmainham Jail in Ireland, were ultimately modelled on, where the prisoner was under 24-hour surveillance. And so every aspect of someone who was in prison was surveyed, monitored, and checked. Now, Foucault used Bentham's idea of the panopticon brilliantly and said, well, that's what the modern age is becoming. And the punishment is not always the formal punishment once you're in a prison, but the controlling and moderating of your behavior in the schools, the factories, the hospitals. And this is a crucially important point, because as we get into this educationally dumbed down universe, with a concern about the radicalization of the young, which even people like Jimmy Carter were concerned about 30 years ago, with the firing of tenured radical professors all throughout the world, particularly in North American universities now, there is a genuine concern that they don't want people who are not singing for their supper or undermining the corporate sponsors. And there is also a sense of the control of the schools by what I would call deviant people, Christian and Catholic fundamentalists, moral majority types, people enforcing dreadful family values in people, the control of schools, hospitals, and factories, and breeding an atmosphere of ultra-conformity, compliance to authority, and the curtailment of dissidence. And Foucault saw that coming, and he saw that the panopticon of prison could be transferred into techniques of surveillance and control that people have throughout their entire lives. And if they buck the trend and they move beyond, then the sanctions and consequences become ever the more dramatic. And in this day and age, they become all the more dramatic. Now, I think he's right about that. The second idea of his, which I think is vitally important, and I've been working on a piece in him, and I haven't finalized it yet, because I keep thinking about it. And yet again, Foucault is emblematic of the trend I was talking about, of how a public intellectual ends up in law all the time, because there's discipline and punishment, about concepts of punishment. And his other book of significant merit is Madness and Civilization, which is his book about how the Enlightenment created lunatic asylums by defining rationality. In other words, that which was created by Voltaire and Descartes, D'Alembert, Montaigne, and the Scottish Enlightenment human, all of that, the concept of reason and rationality and order, leads to institutional structures that deal with the confinement of those that are deemed to be mad and the development of the insane asylum. Now, why I haven't resolved all of this in my own mind is that concepts of madness or deviance have always been concepts of, at one level, of control by the state and controlled by institutional authority. If you think of the famous film of the 1970s with Jack Nicholson, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it is not that he is mad at all. He is far from mad. He's a very sensible human being. But the Nurse Ratched type state authoritarian person defines him as mad because he's not going to put up with her bullshit. Now, in a way, that's a kind of last gasp of the hippie generation kind of mindset, but it's also very important because what we're talking about is a redefinition by a certain consensus, ultra-corporate, neoliberal, family values, statist, conformist, that those who even mildly disagree with their viewpoint at this stage are going to be deemed at one level mad or subversives. And I wrote an article in the Sandra Voice about the subversion of subversives, subversion by subversives. So a whole gaggle of people, human rights lawyers, journalists, public intellectuals, anyone who disagrees with fascism, state authoritarianism, prejudgment, the breach of the rule of law, corporate exploitation, the destruction of the environment, the hoovering of all of assets to 1% of the community, will soon be deemed mad because they control the networks. And that which doesn't play on Fox News or that which doesn't play on RT News, that isn't part of balanced coverage, is now deemed mad. So Foucault's interesting about this. Now, it's a structuralist perspective because what he's effectively saying is that concepts of rationality and madness are episodic or periodic and depend, of course, on each generation's interpretation of saying. All well and good if you're dealing with the Enlightenment of the 18th century and the salon culture. Once you're dealing with the awfulness today of what the establishment is, it is a cause for concern. Foucault, lastly, I suppose, is engaged in his book on sexuality in a huge amount of probably excessive sexual experimentation, which ultimately killed him through AIDS. And in that sense, I think he's a negative influence. I hate to be a bit puritanical about this. I mean, obviously led to a very rich bunch of books. But I do think he's kind of pandering to libertarianism and bohemianism by that mindset. And of course, the corporate age wants us to be very hedonistic and spend lots of money and concern ourselves with our private life so we don't, in Camus' terms, back to him, get engaged in politics, the notion of engagement.